Welcome to the Going Green podcast, and today we're going to have a look at trees. I remember a rhyme, Paul,
Right.
and I remember a rhyme that went, plant a tree in 73 and plant some more in 74. There are a few more rhymes that go on after that, but still.
It's one of those things where I read it was then See It and Die in 75, and then Birds from Sticks in 76.
Yeah, and 76 really was quite a good year for burning. But 50 years on, we're still in the same sort of position we were in almost 50 years ago. We still desperately need to plant more trees.
Well, I'll take it back a step. The
Yeah.
reason the campaign of the Grow a Tree in 73 was introduced, because that's when we had Elm's disease.
That's it. Right.
Trees were basically dying.
Dutch elm
That was
disease.
it, yeah. And so suddenly they had all these diseased trees, which they had to get rid of, so they needed new trees to replace them. Whereas now the problem is we're not trying to replace these trees. They're not dying out. We just need more of them. So it's
because they sequester carbon, isn't it? Simply as that. A tree is pretty good at growing sort of from nothing, from a little acorn. A mighty oak doth grow, it's sort of, you've got this little acorn, and that is going to basically sequester all that carbon dioxide to build this enormous oak tree some sort of 50, 100, 150 years later.
Yeah. And that's fair. So why we're talking about trees is that coming up on this Saturday, the 26th, is the start
Of November.
Of November, yes, is the start of National Tree Week, which of course is when the campaign in the 73 came about to deal with these things. And so far they've been doing it every year, where they've been talking about trees and planting things and doing all things.
Because this is the time of year where you plant trees, simply as that, isn't it?
It's I suppose, like much where the Queen's Green Canopy, that's now advertising to plant some trees, because of course that's trying to go in the effort, and they've extended it to this year, and put it through, because of course this is the time to plant them. And in recognition of, not necessarily of National Tree Week, but of all this climate action, climate change, and all these sort of things, Wales has decided that every household in Wales can have a tree for free.
Yeah, from technically it's tomorrow, isn't it?
No, it started last Saturday.
Last Saturday, so they can start they can collect them now, and get busy growing some trees.
Yeah,
or tree.
Well, they're currently they are offering approximately, say, like 10 saplings, or sapling types, not 10 saplings, but to go out, and they want to plant an estimated 300,000 trees this winter, this tree planting season. And so
I was going to ask you then, they're going to plant these trees. Are they expected to take them home and plant them in their garden, or are they going to plant them elsewhere?
The answer to that question is a little bit of A, a little bit B. Essentially, what they're doing is you can go and collect your sapling from 50 locations around Wales, and basically you have been told to plant it wherever, not you can, but wherever you are allowed to, which is the most. So, of course, in your backyard, of course, you are allowed to plant a tree in your backyard. If you've got an allotment, you can technically plant a tree in your allotment, but you can't just go to a random field and just plant a tree. That's essentially the point is it's personal where you're allowed to plant a tree, not public planting tree. Because, of course, there's a problem. You can't just plant a tree and say, this is my tree. Anybody stumps it. And so, but the idea is that, this 300,000 trees to be planted. And then hopefully they said in the next coming years that they said they'll campaign to do another one. Now, they haven't quite thought this through. Because of course, if I plant a tree in my back garden, I can't plant another tree in the back garden because there's a tree growing in it. Uh, which is so they're gonna have to look up next. But if you haven't got a tree, because that's what they're saying, most people don't, then you can grow on. Like next year they might have, say, tree food fertilizers or something. Whatever.
Keep your tree alive
Yeah,
in,
but that's
in
next.
2025. Yes.
Yeah, that's next year's campaign. This year's campaign is purely here. Have a tree, plant it. That's fairly reasonable, fairly, because how I was looking up how expensive is a tree to plant. And the dumbest question I've ever asked is the question is how big is the tree you're planting? Because the bigger it is, the more expensive it is to plant, and the smaller it is, the cheaper. And so the cost of these plants or these saplings that they're giving out is approximately equal to probably about £5, as in you're buying a £5 tree, essentially.
Because they're all quite small, aren't they?
They're all small. They said they're all saplings are approximately a foot high because they wanted to make sure they could not withstand.
But yeah, we survived the transplanting
Yes.
and tender loving care of little ones.
Yes. So that's what they're essentially. I mean, obviously, you might find a 2-foot one, or you might find a barely underfoot one. A variety is the spice of life, but essentially there are.
They're a year old.
They're a year old, and they're ready to be planted and grow and sort of mature.
Now, on this topic, we have at the moment with us quite a few trees, haven't we? That we're gonna basically they're not trees. I'll be honest with you. We've got some sweet chestnuts, which we've collected. We have some acorns, which you haven't collected yet.
No, well, I've been not brave enough to go outside in the wet and cold to do so.
Yeah,
we need to do
but
so.
we have an oak tree we're going to get. We have some sycamore seeds and
Another sycamore-esque like tree, but
one we haven't yet determined what it is, but we'll find out sort of soon enough. And we're going to try and grow some of these little trees. We're going to get them to their year old, and then hopefully we will manage to give them away to various people who can plant them. I reckon the sweet chestnuts might go down quite well, thinking people might be able to get some of those later. But we're hoping we might be able to do something with some of these trees. So we're going to plant probably and hopefully get something like about 20 to 30 trees.
yeah, and that's just a separate project we're doing as a small pup, so that's not major. But of course, we are planning to grow these saplings and then plant them. So we will be increasing the tree supply of the world by 30.
We hope, yeah.
Anyway, now would you like to know something other bit interesting about trees going through? And I'm going to tell you. Did you know that in the last, I say, 20 years, because that's when they studied as opposed to things, trees have got 8% bigger.
Do you think that could be something to do with the amount of carbon dioxide in the air?
Well, that's what the research says. So that's what they're obviously thinking, because they said one of the dumb things is they can't measure it directly because, of course, all trees are outside. So how do you see somebody, they grow? And they said, well, they looked at the growth of 20 years ago to see how big a tree got, and then they measured the same growth of a new tree in the same 20 years, if that makes any sense. And essentially it found to be between 8 to 13% bigger, and it's actually larger
yeah. So that could be
size.
carbon dioxide. That also could be due to climate change, of course, as well, because it's warmer. And if it's warmer and wetter, which is what we get in the UK, it means that it's better growing conditions for trees. What do trees want? They want water and they want carbon dioxide. And if you can give them both of those and a little bit of sunshine, they're going to be really happy and they're going to grow and they're going to absorb all this wonderful carbon dioxide out of the air.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's the lovely story, isn't it?
That's the story. Anyway, so the next, and then they've been talking about sort of how the increase in carbon dioxide in the air is causing something known as carbon fertilization. And
Yeah, go on.
it's essentially that the more CO2, the more the plant works, because there's more CO2 for the plants to do photosynthesis at. Yeah, which is, yeah, as we say, which is the
Yeah.
fairly not the most
Well,
interesting thing.
as a scientist, one of the things that I do with students is we look at photosynthesis and we measure things that are rate limiting factors, which are light. One of the ones we can do, we can change the amount of light, but the other one, of course, is carbon dioxide. And the more carbon dioxide there is, the happier a plant is up to a certain point. And when you get more than a certain amount of carbon dioxide, it doesn't make any difference. But if the plants are effectively starved of carbon dioxide, then they don't grow as much as if they have an adequate supply of carbon dioxide.
Yeah. So that this is what this is. There's a report about this carbon fertilization is essentially that previously, when we thought carbon wasn't the limiting factor, or we know it is, but we didn't think it was being limited. We actually are now being found out that the carbon side, it was in plants, photosynthesis was being limited. And so now that the atmosphere has more CO2, unfortunately, plants have now woken up to the fact there is more and are basically growing more. Between, as I said, 8 to 13%. Not much, not big, but it's one of those things where we're not pushing the limits because they might hit a limit where there's too much CO2, and unfortunately, that's when the plants suffer, because that's when it's just too much. But we have yet to hit the upper limit of how much more CO2 the plants can deal with.
But although these trees are bigger, are they bigger and stronger, or are they bigger but weaker?
Well, that's one of the interesting things that they've come up with. They've been looking at whether or not having more increase in the CO2 content of the tree, as in more sequestered into the tree, they're actually finding that not the trees have become airier, but essentially the wood density of the tree is less, is basically decreasing, even though the size of the tree is bigger, which actually definitely makes sense because the density of wood remains the same, but it's just bigger. Therefore, somehow the density must decrease because, of course, that's how it works in ratios and maths.
So that's probably means it's bigger cells.
Yeah, so it is, as I said, that means the volume's increasing. That means that's how the density is going down.
But
So,
that does mean that if wood isn't as strong as it used to be, then could there be more damage to these trees from storms? And we're seeing there are certainly more storms. And are they then less likely to be soaking up more greenhouse gases? Or might they actually, if they're going to be less dense, are they going to be less efficient at soaking up the carbon dioxide? That's a question I know that is being researched at the moment. So we were reading about a scientist, an ecologist, having a look at this in Massachusetts in America, and he was trying to work out whether these trees, because they're less dense, are going to be perhaps sort of less efficient. But that we'll have to wait for the study to take place so we can actually find out, because we're only just starting to discover these things at the moment. So it's a question is, has the quality of this wood changed because they've started growing more? And at the moment, this is now being monitored to try and see what's happening. So wood density has decreased from 8% to 12%, in that sort of range, over the last 20 years. increasing temperatures will give us a faster growth spurt. And if that happens, then usually the rings are slightly wider. And when you get wider rings on trees, they're usually a little less dense. But basically, are there any other problems? Like, if you've got a tree growing faster, can it get enough of other things it wants? When I talk to my students, they often talk about feeding trees, and we talk about feeding trees, putting fertilizer on them. But the poor old trees normally growing out in the wild outside don't get looked after like the plants in the garden, and they get their sort of extra nitrogen that they need to make proteins, well, from where they can really. And if they're lucky, they're in a good place, they can get lots. And if they're not, well, they can't uproot and move. They're not triffids.
Well, yeah. Well, this is they were talking about how, at Darfleet, trees along, not motorways, but roads in general, where they have actually been stifled because of the uh, increase in nitrogen dioxides in the air around them that are being polluted from the cars, and saying that's actually too much nitrogen for them to cope with.
Yeah, too much is even worse sometimes than not enough.
Yeah.
It's a big problem.
So
we're looking at here, are there any negative changes to this? Well, yeah, we can talk about that, but that's far less important than the positive change, which is basically we can have more trees and they're growing faster and they are sequestering generally more carbon dioxide. And that at the moment, with the really good results from COP27, which was sort of, oh, we're not going to we're not going to do anything about more fossil fuels, are we? We're not going to sort of cut anything at the moment. I think that's basically the results of COP27. Yeah. And so we've got to think about then more about things like trees and what you might be able to do. So might you think that you could plant a tree now? Would you like to go out and plant a tree?
Yeah, there's all sorts of there's those charities going for them. I know that the charitable, not foundation, but the charitable cause called Team Trees, they've managed to plant over 20 million trees so far, cumulative, and they're well on their way to go and plant all sorts of things. So that's working quite happily. And we know that, say, the from last COP26, the one held in the UK last year, the world, a majority of the world, signed a bill to reforest the world. Now, unfortunately, this year some countries did pull out of that, which is a bit of a shame, but we'll glance over that. And so this could be an opportunity for the reforesting to actually take a grip and actually move forward and beyond. And hopefully we can actually hit the goal of I think it's like 50% increase in trees. It was something quite large and substantial at COP26. I can't remember the true number, but it essentially was we wanted to double the size of our forests and double the number of trees being planted and all sorts of, and by doing these things, it's useful.
So there are two options if you want to grow a tree. One, you can go and, well, there are lots of seeds around. We have found, just wandering around, we can pick up loads. And rather than leaving them where they are, you can nurture them a little bit, bring them on for a year, and then go and plant them somewhere. Kids absolutely adore doing this. They watch the trees grow. And I know from when I was a child growing a tree, and I'm now getting along a little bit. And the trees that I planted when I was a little kid are now massive, great big things. Although I will be honest, a couple of them my mother did chop down.
Yes, well, not necessarily a green thumb, although she's a keen gardener.
It's in the wrong place.
Wrong in the wrong place, yes. So, yeah, there's all these sort of things of trying to do these things about growing trees and planting trees and working out in the right places. And of course, what needs to be planted, of course, not is the right tree in the right place, but a native tree that's native to that location. So, yeah, you don't want to place, say, a foreign tree in in your backyard because, of course, not
Yeah,
that it's
yeah.
going to
A
do any.
giant sequoia is possibly not the best thing to put into your back garden.
No,
One of my students does have one of those in their back garden, and it's not that old, and it's already absolutely massive, and it's at the bottom of their garden, and they're now starting to worry about the roots uh, undermining the house.
yes. What can I say? That that's how it goes. That's how it goes.
Big tree.
Yeah, but it is one of those things where placing trees where they're not necessarily needed, but where they're, it's why in the going back to the Wales, they're giving out 10 types of saplings because, of course, they don't know who's going to pick up a tree and and there are people on there advising, saying, "Oh, where do you live? What's the environment you live in? Oh, then you need this one," as opposed to you pick a random one. But
But that's good education as well, really. It's trying to teach people about trees, and if you grow the right tree in the right place and you can watch it grow, it's nothing nicer than actually having a nice little tree in the back garden that you can then sit under, and in the heat of all this climate change, you can sit in a little bit of shade. Uh, or you can then moan about all the leaves you have to pick up in the autumn. I'm not going to mention who says that, am I, Paul?
well, no. But
No.
there is another, I say, point to all these things is we're coming up to Christmas. Yeah, it's only something daft like 30 odd days till it, so don't panic. And so, one of the big things around Christmas, of course, is your Christmas tree. And it's coming up to the season where it's I say it's Christmas tree shopping season.
Now, the sorts of trees you can go and get, you can go and get an artificial tree. Okay, so I don't like an artificial tree because look at it's made of plastic and all those problems. I prefer a real tree. And a few years ago, we went out and bought a real tree. Now, we had two options when we bought this tree. We could either buy the top of a tree which someone's just sort of sawn off, uh, or a real living tree. And possibly knowing me, you'd suggest that, yes, that's the one I went for, which is what I did. And we bought this tree in a pot. What's his name?
It was Frederick because
Frederick,
that was
yes.
his name. Bits.
Yeah, so Frederick is our tree. And unfortunately, Frederick died. We did our very best to sort of keep him going, but for some reason, Frederick died. And so we had Frederick II, the resurrection, and Frederick II, performed well for 2 or 3 years, getting bigger and bigger, living outside. Well, in fact, we had him living outside all the time, but in a pot. And then poor little Frederick II was visited severely by the cat.
Yeah, well, that's the problem with these trees. As I said, that's why.
And in a pot, he didn't stand much chance, yes.
No. So we anyway. So back to the actual story of these Christmas trees is, of course,
Frederick III.
Frederick Free. Well, we've tried multiple times with Christmas, but you can actually, instead of having a chopped down tree, you can get a living tree, or you could rent a tree.
What a good idea.
This is the whole. Now you can basically you get one of these trees, and essentially for over, like say, 7 years, you get the same tree back every year. Because what they do is after a year at Christmas, they take them out of the ground and they plant them somewhere else, move them around. But over Christmas, the trees don't grow because they're in hibernation mode, so they don't really care where they go, and so potentially, they're quite happy to come along and live in your house for a month, and then they go back home and they grow for another year. Anyway, so the idea of sort of is this opportunity of renting a Christmas tree. as they say, unfortunately, say what a dog is for life, not just for Christmas, but instead you can get a tree just for Christmas. I'm not quite sure on the logo or the
Yeah.
tagline, but yeah,
And then give it back.
yeah,
They look after it, which is probably better than letting me look after it, because I've managed to kill 2 so far.
yeah, and well, the point is, of course, what happens is, of course, they're just nurturing saplings to grow and be planted in forest, and so is it really going to matter that they have to unplant them to move them round because they're plotting them, because they take them from useful and put them in bigger pots, you see, just to keep them going.
And
Is
they
it?
make more money on it, really, don't they? This is part of the thing. This is helping the nursery. They can actually make some extra money on the tree by you going and grabbing it, looking after it over Christmas, and then bringing it back, and they sort of help it recover, and then make it grow a bit bigger, and so the year after you can have it. One of the reasons they don't bother after 7 years is it doesn't fit in the house, as well as other problems, of course, like the tree doesn't want to move too much
Yeah,
then.
it gets a bit heavy. Yeah, it's one of those things where you can get different heights of trees and small little ones and big ones, and sort of you just get it, and then you have it for basically not you sign a 7 year contract. That's the wrong way to put it, but essentially, if you get one this year, next year you have the option of getting the same one you had last year back, if that makes sense. Because that's because they're tagged and numbered and they know who's who. Or so there's no problem that way. And then after 7 years, the tree which you've been helping, you know, is then sent to a proper larger nursery to grow big and tall and strong. And the process starts again. And because, how long does it take for a tree to not to mature? That's the wrong way to get, but to become strong enough to actually survive on its own. And it is 7 years, and so that's the point around which,
Yeah, after that size, the vandal can't knock it over. It's just too big.
yeah. So that's the reason of this process and why nurseries exist, because it is a nursery because the trees are young. Yeah, look how old trees can get by the number of tree rings, of course, being cutting down and all over the place. So there you go. There's a small. Now I have some unfortunate news about um currently our local rent a tree place in London, all the trees are sold out.
And that's sad, but it's also really good news, isn't it?
Yeah, and that just meaning it's just they just sold out because, well, they just sold it out. They sold out. So you know
If you want to do this, you can't this year, but you can think about doing it next year.
yeah. So
So planting a tree is something that we recommend. If you can't plant a tree, if you can't get one for Christmas, then why don't you go out for a little walk and pick up some tree seeds? There are loads around at the moment still that haven't been eaten by various birds and other animals, and you can collect them, plant them. A lot of them actually want to be uh, left outside. You can be really good with them. You just collect them in a little bag and keep them sort of in some damp soil, and just sort of leave them. And then hopefully in the spring, they start to grow. You don't actually have to do an awful lot with them.
no,
And then you can sort of look after these, tend to them, look after them, love them, talk to them. And then when they've got a, a reasonable size, give them away or plant them elsewhere so that you can manage to do your bit for the environment. You've been listening to the Going Green podcast talking about trees. Hopefully, we'll be back next week, wind, rain, storms, etc. permitting. And until then, stay safe. And if you can't do anything else, go and plant a tree. It's goodbye from me.
and a goodbye from me.
Bye bye.
Bye.